Hi, I just want to welcome you all and thank you for coming to the third CSPT Colloquium of the year, the first of 2014. We'd like to welcome Deanne LeBlanc, who's a second-year MA student in CSPT, coming to us from Political Science, and she's going to give some initial thoughts on identifying the settler denizen within colonialism. And just before I give it over to her, I just want to solicit one last time. We're finalizing the call for papers for the final two colloquia. So if there's any students or faculty that would like to contribute a paper, there's still a couple of spaces that could be arranged. So with no further ado, I'll hand it over to Deanne.
Thank you. And thank you guys all for coming out today, and specifically to the Cultural, Social, and Political Thought Program for giving me the venue to present my research. Before I begin, I'd like to acknowledge that we're on the traditional territories of the Coast and Strait Salish peoples. So the research I'm presenting today is a snapshot of the research that I have completed thus far for my master's thesis, and will contribute to the development of a PhD dissertation in the hopefully not so distant future. So this all centers on the specific research question: what role do non-Indigenous peoples play within colonialism? And this is a complex question to answer that requires an equally complex answer, and for which I can only purport to have begun to answer here. But I do believe I have a solid beginning, and I'd like to share it with you today. So I'd like to begin this presentation with a short personal narrative of how I came to this research question. Because how we come to know our identities as settler denizens, or as settlers, is just as important as the knowing itself. The narrative also serves to situate me within my work, and when dealing with colonialism and identity, I believe this is also an important step to be taken. Following this narrative, I've separated my presentation into three parts. Part 1 will offer a preliminary definition of the term settler denizen. Focus will be given here to stories and treaties, and the idea that settler denizens are hindered in their ability to engage in treaty citizenship. Treaty citizenship is a concept I've taken from Saugij Henderson's work, where he presents the idea of an informal citizenship that predates the formation of Canada, wherein original treaties made between Indigenous and settler peoples to share the land not only justifies settler presence, but established a relationship between peoples who hold responsibilities toward each other. So through the second part of my presentation, I will offer a rationale for why it's important to explore the roles settlers play, or settler denizens play within colonialism. And through the third and final section of my presentation, I'll identify three interconnected roles that settler denizens play within colonialism, and use these roles as heuristic devices that enable us to begin conceptualizing how settler denizens contribute to colonial processes. So, I completed my undergrad at the University of Toronto in Political Science and Aboriginal Studies. In my last year of studies, I was taking a Native Language and Cultures class with an elder from Treaty 9 territory, Alex McKay. The focus of our class was on the Adasoganon and Adasoganok, the traditional legends and major characters within Ojibwe oral tradition. An important part of what we learned as a class of Indigenous and non-Indigenous peoples was the importance of stories in connecting us to a place, a territory, and a culture. During one of our classes, a non-Indigenous girl who had grown up in British Columbia spoke up, voicing her worry and disappointment over her belief that she did not have stories. She didn't have traditional or ancestral stories that connected her to anywhere. She was just a white girl floating around Canada and did not really belong, was not really connected to any place. So her contribution to the class on this day was weighted and resulted in a quite tense class silence. And I was personally stunned. As a 12th generation French Canadian on my father's side, I had never questioned, or to be honest, given much thought to, my familial history, our stories, and my sense of belonging in Canada. I derive from a group of original settlers, part of the two founding nations of Canada, I belonged and had stories even if I didn't know them. But then I began to think of the family on my mother's side. On my mother's side, I'm only a third-generation Irish Canadian. But then I also knew that the Irish had a history of famine and immigration, and that although I didn't know my family's specific stories, I knew we must still have them. But I also realized that the sense of culture and distinctness was not nearly as strong on my mother's side as on my father's. Which is interesting, and one might actually think that it would be the other way around. But regardless, in the minutes that followed my peers' contribution, I began to realize that as a settler who had grown up with a family who discussed their ancestral roots, I was privileged. It dawned on me that many non-Indigenous Canadians, specifically those of Western European descent whose families had only been here for a few generations, such as my peer, likely did not have such a clear sense of where they came from, and had perhaps not given it much consideration. They were just Canadian. Their history and sense of self grew from the point of settlement, and the before was silenced, ignored, or shrouded in a hazy mystery that no one was quite interested enough to explore. So after riding the silence for a while, Alex was always particularly good at that, he finally spoke up and calmly replied to the girl, "We all have stories, you just don't know yours yet." I don't know whatever happened to her, or if she ever eventually looked into what her stories were, but the exchange and my reaction to it is what led me down this research path, because even if I didn't know why, I knew that it was integral that settlers know their own stories, and that not knowing them enables us to contribute to colonialism within Canada. But I am starting to get ahead of myself. So, I'd like to start with my first part in terms of deciphering what it means when I refer to the settler denizen. So first of all, when I use the term settler, I'm using it to broadly refer to all non-Indigenous peoples living within Canada. For the purposes of my research here, I'm not interested in differentiating between different settler identities. For instance, how a first-generation Canadian from Pakistan, Sweden, or China might situate differently within a settler identity than being a seventh-generation Canadian from Britain or France. I do, however, realize there are still important differences between settler situations in this respect, but I'm more interested in exploring how settler difference is a function of state integration rather than identity, where settlers are differently situated due to their entrenchment within the colonial project. For instance, does a settler have full citizenship? Are they property owners? How much do they have invested within colonial state mechanisms? I think in respect to my specific project, this is a much more prudent way of conceptualizing the different positions of settlers, where this difference in state integration plays a role within determining an individual settler's responsibility towards decolonization. So this differentiation, while important to keep in mind, is largely beyond the bounds of this specific presentation. But this is the understanding of the term settler I'll be using throughout my presentation when I employ the term. So what do I mean by the term denizen? In the Oxford English Dictionary, a denizen is referred to as one who lives habitually in a country but is not a native-born citizen. Set in contrast to citizen, then, a denizen is one who inhabits a space but who does not necessarily hold a full membership or citizenship to the same space. Within my employment of the term, I'm interested in extending the concept of denizen into an ethical space of membership engagement, where the settler denizen is one who is non-Indigenous to the lands he or she inhabits, and who also does not recognize nor actively engage with what justifies his or her presence on the lands that he or she has settled. In other words, a settler denizen is a settler who does not know and does not engage with his or her pre-settlement stories, nor actively engages with his or her settlement story, which necessarily includes considering the state settlement story, treaty settlement stories, and their connections with the personal stories. So these are stories and connections which represent crucial aspects of justification for a settler's presence on the land. And while knowing stories is not a sufficient step towards justification, it is a necessary step. And it is because the settler denizen does not acknowledge the settlement stories which justify his or her presence on the land, that the settler denizen remains only in partial membership to the land and its original peoples, and therefore actually prohibits his or her own attainment of full treaty citizenship, an original citizenship established through treaty relations that contributes to justification of settler presence within Canada today. So originally, treaties between early settlers and Indigenous peoples, and documents such as the Royal Proclamation, were made with the view to share the land. It is through peace and friendship treaties and agreements, and perhaps we can even extend this to the numbered treaties, that Indigenous and settler peoples agreed to share the land as autonomous and yet interdependent peoples. These agreements establish responsibilities between treaty members, where membership extends beyond Indigenous and state negotiators to all those affected or living in the area of the treaty. And so membership includes the original colonial subjects, their descendants, and those who currently inhabit the area. Acknowledging and engaging with one's treaty citizenship is a responsibility that non-Indigenous peoples hold by virtue of the ongoing nature of treaties, although the current Canadian population, en masse, today does not currently recognize this fact. So those settlers who either knowingly and intentionally contribute to Indigenous subordination and dispossession without redress, or those who do not recognize nor actively engage with their histories and with their roles within colonialism and decolonization, are then contributing to their status as denizen because they are not recognized. And what this treaty citizenship means varies across time and locality, but exists nonetheless and must be revisited and renewed through meaningful dialogue between Indigenous and settler peoples. In the case of British Columbia, where much of the land was settled by non-Indigenous peoples without treaty, this means that treaty citizenship must first be established. So a settler denizen becomes a settler citizen through his or her recognition of agency within colonialism as an ongoing process, his or her subsequent recognition of responsibility for action within decolonial processes, and his or her recognition and engagement with treaty citizenship, which is specific to time and place. So while important to explaining the foundations of and goals of foundations for and goals of my research, understanding how a settler denizen might come or become a settler citizen is ultimately beyond the bounds of this presentation. And for the purposes of this presentation, then, focus will remain on conceptualizing the role of settler denizen within Canadian colonialism. Sorry, my throat's like really dry. So before we get on to part 2 of my presentation, or discussing why it's important to situate the role of settler denizen within colonialism, I think it's necessary to provide a brief overview of my definition of colonialism that I've been working with. So I place my work specifically within the growing field of settler colonialism. Through settler colonial literature, specifically here I focus on the works of Patrick Wolfe and Lorenzo Veracini, an important distinction has been made between external and internal modes of colonialism. Within this distinction, external colonialism refers to a system of permanent subordination imposed on an Indigenous other by an external imperial power. Within the Canadian context, this external entity is Britain. Under the external system, the colonizing power is concerned with exploiting the Indigenous other for labor and economic gain. Alternatively, internal or settler colonialism refers to what is commonly cited as a structure imposed on an Indigenous other by a settled colony cohabiting Indigenous lands. Within this later mode of colonialism, the internal colonizing power seeks to eliminate the Indigenous other. The distinction drawn between the external and internal colonialism is important as both forms are animated by divergent goals and therefore practice alternative colonial means. So while I disagree with the idea that settler colonialism is a structure, and putting forward the idea that it's actually a dynamic process involving a multiplicity of actors, the characterization of what animates settler colonialism is important to discuss. The settler colonizer is concerned with the elimination of the indigenous other for the purposes of its own justifiable settlement and territorial expansion over indigenous lands. In the words of Patrick Wolfe, settler colonialism destroys to replace. Destruction or elimination in this context does not necessarily mean that the settler colonizer seeks to directly and violently exterminate another. Elimination can, and increasingly in contemporary societies does, include policies that seek to erase the other through internalizing indigenous difference in terms of direct assimilation, recognition, and reconciliation. So elimination by these means serves to neutralize through internalizing indigenous difference within the settler state order. And this internalization of indigenous difference is seen as necessary not only for the settlement and expansion of the settler society, it also symbolically marks the settler society's independence from an original external colonial power, as the settler state is able to indigenize itself. It's important to note here, however, that colonialism is far more than a process of territorial appropriation. It includes social, cultural, economic, and even psychological appropriations and rewritings as well. So, moving on to the second part. Why is it important to identify the role of settler denizen within colonialism? Predominantly speaking, the settler colonial literature uses the term settler without differentiating between state and non-state actors. So while non-state actors include collectives throughout civil society, my focus will remain on the role of the denizen. Their settlement stories and justifications for settlement differ in form and substance from organized collectives within the broader society. But this lack of differentiation within the literature is problematic because it serves to silence the various ways through which differently situated actors contribute to colonialism, and consequently serves to diminish the dynamic nature of colonialism within Canada. Settler denizen roles are also ignored, or perhaps more accurately, sidelined, within contemporary state-led law and policy established to achieve reconciliation. So non-Indigenous Canadians have and continue to impact processes of colonialism within Canada. Through owning state-established property over traditional lands, through passively accepting state narratives of settlement and history, through squatting on lands that do not belong to them, through appropriating Indigenous cultures, and through a plethora of other ways that non-Indigenous peoples contribute to processes of colonialism that subordinate and dispossess Indigenous peoples and serve to silence treaty citizenship. And it is because of this ongoing involvement within colonialism, whether conscious or not, that settler denizens are necessarily implicated within processes of decolonization. To move toward decolonization efforts without denizen acknowledgement of these facts and their active support for decolonization will lead to failed efforts. Non-Indigenous Canadians simply represent too large and too powerful a group within Canadian society. And because of these realities, it is not enough to solely focus on the state and Indigenous peoples. The active roles that settler denizens play within processes of both colonialism and decolonization is currently ignored by state law, policies, and initiatives focused on colonial reconciliation. Recent state initiatives such as the Royal Proclamation on Aboriginal Peoples and the Truth and Reconciliation Commission have certainly encouraged non-Indigenous Canadians to acknowledge the presence of colonialism within the state's history. And this has been a positive step. Slowly, non-Indigenous Canadians have become more aware of certain colonial realities, like the Indian and residential school system. These state-led initiatives, however, seek to address historic moments of colonialism as quickly and painlessly as possible, thereby distancing the state and society from such past colonial events. The state is adamant in its treatment of colonialism as an historic event. In the words of Jeff Corntassel and Cindy Calder, the state is therefore focused on neutralizing a history of wrongs through identifying, internalizing, and historicizing colonialism. State-led reconciliatory initiatives are primarily concerned with limiting state liability and culpability. which prohibits the facilitation of meaningful societal dialogue. And as a result of this state's mentality, there is no room for the state to include its citizenry, the settler denizens, within state processes of reconciliation. So while many settler denizens might recognize the existence of colonial structures and processes, the state enables them to ignore any recognition of their own agency and responsibility pertaining to Indigenous subordination and dispossession. The historic state becomes the sole active and responsible party that settler denizens can point to as the colonial perpetrator. But this simply isn't true. Colonialism is not an historic event from which we can distance ourselves. It is an ongoing process through which multiple actors are implicated. So moving on to the third part of my presentation, how to begin conceptualizing the roles settler denizens play within colonialism. So I've taken on a heuristic method of beginning to conceptualize this through the use of three interconnected roles that settler denizens play within colonial processes. These three main roles include the influential actor, the state instrument, and the petty sovereign. The first two roles relate specifically to settler denizens' relationship to the state, how they influence and are influenced by state action, and therefore serves as a tool to explore their indirect influences and responsibilities within colonialism. The last role, the petty sovereign, is a term I've taken from Judith Butler's Precarious Life, where she defines petty sovereign as those who are unknowing to a degree about what work they do, but performing their acts unilaterally and with enormous consequence. Their acts are clearly conditioned, but their acts are judgments that are nevertheless unconditional, in the sense that they are final, not subject to review, and not subject to appeal. So in other words, the petty sovereign is one who acts, although conditioned by another, with diminished sovereign power over others, and who cannot be held accountable for such acts due to this diminished sovereignty. Within Precarious Life, Butler is specifically applying this term to government officials in Guantanamo Bay, whose actions impact the indefinitely detained. I am choosing to extend this term to settler denizens, non-state actors, which would appear to contradict Butler's application, but it is her characterization of the petty sovereign, how the actor functions, that I believe can be applied to non-state actors. So in this way, the settler denizen can be seen to be an actor not fully cognizant of the colonial implications of his or her actions through which the denizen capitalizes on an unspoken, unexplored settler privilege. And since this privilege is a silent and passive benefit afforded to settler denizens, actors that capitalize on this privilege are by and large not held accountable for actions that negatively impact Indigenous peoples. So I'll get more into this application of Butler's term and the concept of settler privilege below, but I'm using the term here to explore ways through which settler denizen action enjoys greater independence from, though still conditioned by, state influence, therefore enabling us to explore a more direct colonial responsibility held by settler denizens. So, a settler denizen's role as influential actor refers to his or her ability to exert power or pressure over the state's actions. This ability to influence is derived from already existing relationships between the Canadian state and its citizenry. Canada is a representative democracy. In order to form government, the country's federal and provincial political parties are dependent on receiving citizens' votes. The government in power is aware that it must retain the support of its citizens, of the citizens it represents, in order to be re-elected. And this dependency establishes a relationship wherein the citizenry, at least in theory, holds the government accountable for its actions. So I've identified two specific ways through which we can see citizen influence over state action. And specifically when I refer to state action, I'm referring to the actions of the legislative and executive branches. First of all is citizen influence through governmental elections. Elections represent organized moments through which its citizens can demand change from their government. However, the Canadian citizenry continues to elect governments that ignore colonial issues. There is no significant demand from the citizenry, by way of elections, that the government confront the fragile basis from which it has conceived its sovereignty, to reconsider property regimes and resource development, or national identity projects, and to make substantive changes to state systems and societal relations. This suggests that perhaps the problem resides with settler denizens. They are the reason the state doesn't deal with these colonial issues, because settler denizens, as the majority, aren't demanding that the state does. But this inaction on behalf of the citizenry has been influenced by years of government implemented socialization through things like public education that has encouraged non-Indigenous Canadians to ignore these colonial realities. So both actors capitalize on this muddled line of accountability to shirk responsibility off to the other. Ultimately, however, it is the citizenry that does hold the power within this relationship to change things. The citizenry can demand through elections that the government it elects begins to address these issues, and it can demand and create a political party that will. Secondly, and related to the previous method, citizens can influence state actions through their ability to protest and rebel against current government actions. And this form of influence is not confined to a specific time or place, as seen with electoral methods. The citizenry can rebel through a variety of different means at a variety of different times. An example of this form of influence, albeit an historical one, is the Upper Canadian Rebellion of 1837. Throughout the 1830s, as the colony's population grew, there was growing unrest among the colonists for greater and cheaper lands and for independence, or greater independence from Britain. The settler denizens' vocalization of unrest during the 1837 rebellion shows that these settlers were beginning to take an active role in vying for independence of the settler colony and for demanding greater land for their own settlement, thereby contributing to the subordination of Indigenous peoples in Canada, and therefore establishing a line of responsibility within colonialism that led from them through to the government. These settler denizens represented voices in which the colonial sovereign held a vested interest. And so even though colonial British forces quickly put an end to the rebellion and persecuted those who participated, policies of colonial expansion and settlement, including a limited form of responsible government, were eventually brought to the colonies. And the rebels, therefore, influenced the production of greater colonial independence, indirectly contributing to a growth in settler colonial policies of Indigenous dispossession and subordination. But this is only one example of how protest can influence the colonial acts of the settler state. Understanding how settler denizens have influenced colonial actions through both elections and protests will help to begin mapping how non-Indigenous Canadians have indirectly contributed to, and how they continue to indirectly contribute to colonialism. And understanding how this influence works can then be utilized to determine how settler citizens can contribute to processes of decolonization, how they might be able to influence the state and government to begin decolonizing its own actions. But again, I'm not taking up specifically decolonization processes within the presentation. I merely allude to them as an eventual goal towards identifying the role of settler denizen within colonialism. So as we can see, settler denizens have an impact on state action. But the state also uses and influences its citizenry in a multitude of ways. And in fact, as I began to mention with the role of influential actor, an interesting link begins to develop in terms of accountability regarding colonial action between the two actors, the state and its citizen. And since there is such a close connection of mutual influence between the actors, the settler can point to the state when his colonial acts are questioned and say that the state, so long as these acts are legal under the state, justified these actions. And in this way, the settler denizen attempts to shirk his responsibility onto the state. Of course then, and as we'll see with the settler denizen role as state instrument, the state can turn around when its colonial acts are in question and say that it pursued such actions to serve the settler denizen majority, the body whose interest the state strives to serve. Then it's just not really anyone's responsibility to redress such action, because the catalyst behind these actions, delivering the good life to the majority of Canadians, becomes a fact. Why would the liberal democratic state act in any other way if not for the good of the majority of its citizens? But it's this cycle of justification and shirking of responsibility that really has to be questioned and perhaps broken. So beginning to do so requires understanding how the settler state uses settler denizens in instrumental ways to achieve its colonial goals. And there are two primary ways I've identified through which the state does this. The first is by using the settler majority to justify its actions. And the second is through the state's monopoly on public education systems and its approach to reconciliation initiatives as venues for public education. The later of which wouldn't be a problem, except it seems to be the only meaningful way that settler denizens are engaged within reconciliation initiatives. So how does the state use the settler majority to justify its actions? Case law surrounding Section 35 of the Constitution, which protects Aboriginal and treaty rights, represents an important way through which the state accomplishes this. Section 35 case law that deals with third-party interests, in other words, the property interests of the non-Indigenous majority within Canada, actually defines non-Indigenous property holders as innocent beneficiaries of the historic state's colonial actions. In the leading case here, Chippewas of Sarnia Band versus Canada, decided at the provincial level, it was found that those who originally purchased the land around Sarnia, Ontario, under an unlawful surrender, had no way of knowing, and should not have been expected to investigate, the illegality of the patent to the surrendered lands that they took up. The third parties were therefore innocent of any wrongdoing. Under Section 35, then, it appears that within the Aboriginal title case law, third-party innocence is used by the court as a method of sustaining Crown sovereignty over the land. The projected innocence of the non-Indigenous property holder majority is used to justify limiting Indigenous claims in what has been referred to as a zero-sum game. There is a winner and a loser, and within the court, and the presence of an inactive and innocent majority on disputed lands enables the Crown to achieve its legislative win. An innocent party cannot be forced into remedial action. The innocent settler collective cannot be forced to surrender the lands that they have improved. And at the end of the day, under this limited characterization of reconciliation and third-party interests, the Crown retains its underlying sovereignty over the land. And the state points to the settler denizen majority as the reason behind its actions. It's for the greater good. Oops, so sorry. There's nothing we can do. There's that majority over there. But the state's use of settler denizens doesn't stop here. The state in Canada, specifically the provinces, enjoy a monopoly over public education. They decide the methods, models, and content of our learning from a very young age, and the discussion of colonialism as an ongoing process, or even as an historical one when I went to school, was not on the agenda. And this is no small thing. Public education has made the majority of settler denizens quite ignorant of the colonial issues that face Indigenous and settler peoples alike. And this ignorance has been used by the states, or to the state's colonial advantage, and by association, settler denizens' colonial advantage as well. And while this is a huge problem that serves to skew our collective memory in such a way that Indigenous memory is denied a place within our collective memory, and which serves to entrench settler privilege, unfortunately I don't have time to provide it sufficient in-depth analysis. And I also want to still discuss how control over educating the public functions within the state's reconciliation initiatives. So broadly speaking, settler denizen incorporation within reconciliation initiatives is focused on public education, which is great and important. But through initiatives like the Truth and Reconciliation Commission, the public education that is established and disseminated encourages settler denizens to accept a skewed conceptualization of colonialism, that historic, state-driven event, the Indian and residential school system, that was horrible and awful, but that we, as settler denizens, never really had anything to do with, because ultimately it was the state, and that we can now clearly distance ourselves from because it's over. We've given the survivors some compensation. Let's close that chapter of our history. So the public outreach achieved by these initiatives does create a more educated settler denizen population. Now they know that the Indian and residential school system occurred, but this is a safely educated population. One socialized to think on the government's terms and fueled by its own ignorance. One enabled to point to the government responsible, not me. I educated myself and now I can walk away. I hold no further responsibilities. So the settler, state, and citizen are in a complex relationship of influence and responsibility shifting that I've only really just begun to scratch the surface of. A lot more attention and detail need to be given here, but at least it begins to paint a picture of how these two actors influence each other and share responsibility with their contributions to colonialism within Canada. So moving on, how does the petty sovereign fit in here? Let me go briefly over the application that I gave this role. So the settler denizen who acts as petty sovereign is the actor who enjoys passive benefit. He or she is not fully cognizant of his or her settler privilege, the ways through which his or her actions contribute to this privilege, and how his or her actions impact colonial processes. Through this role, the settler denizen, though conditioned by the state, is not actively seeking to influence state action. And as petty sovereign, the settler denizen is instead acting with a diminished awareness and is not held accountable for his or her impact within colonialism. So my original employment of this term was historical. I applied it to the act of squatting on Indigenous lands. Through squatting, settler denizens were individually motivated, thinking about themselves and not the impact their actions had. In other words, how they contributed to the dispossession of Indigenous peoples throughout the colonies. Squatters in this way acted with a diminished awareness. Since the presence of these squatters on unsurrendered lands helped the colonial government negotiate land surrender treaties with Indigenous peoples, for years their actions were actually overlooked. And so these squatters, acting through a diminished sovereignty, were not held accountable for their actions. Recently, however, I've been looking to apply this role of settler denizen today. And so this presentation actually offers my first attempt at it. And so far what I've come up with is that today applying the role of petty sovereign hinges specifically on settler denizen actions or inactions, which lack full cognition and for which settler denizens are not held accountable. This leads me to the concept of settler privilege as a passive benefit, the idea that by virtue of being a settler, one automatically benefits from the same actions which repress Indigenous peoples. And this is a benefit for which settler denizens are largely unaware. This passive benefit enables a myriad of settler denizen actions, which in turn contribute to colonialism. And since action is informed by an unarticulated benefit and is not directed at the state, by and large these actions enjoy impunity. And there are so many benefits settlers enjoy. They're able to exercise their own political order and legal system, even though Indigenous political orders and legal systems are already here. They get to be on the land with no obligations to it, even though Indigenous orders on the same land hold very different views of land ownership and responsibility to it. They benefit from resource development, even though they may extract resources from lands that aren't their own, or resources that aren't their own. And the list could go on. Settler privilege includes all the rights and privileges that settlers enjoy at the expense of Indigenous rights, privileges, and responsibilities. And it's when settler denizens act in ways that capitalize on these privileges that they act as petty sovereigns. So perhaps a quick example of what I mean, or might serve to clarify what I mean when I'm talking about contemporary petty sovereigns. Over the past few years, there's been a trend in the fashion industry for non-Indigenous peoples to dress in native-looking clothes. And so the fashion industry has appropriated important cultural staples and symbols of many Indigenous nations. This includes, but is not limited to, moccasins, cowichan sweaters, headdresses, and dream catchers. And in the past few years, we've seen the release of spirit hoods by a company called Spirit Hoods that produce furry animal hats meant to represent traditional spirit animals. Urban Outfitters released a Navajo-inspired line where they've taken traditional Navajo designs and stuck them on everything from underwear to flasks. Paul Frank came out with a line of clothes where his famous monkey sported a headdress and was framed within a dream catcher. TNA has produced knockoff couch and sweaters. Victoria's Secret sent a model down the runway modeling lingerie and a headdress. And I mean, I could continue, unfortunately. But those who buy into these cultural appropriations, whether consciously or not, are directly contributing to colonialism. Colonialism, as I've mentioned, is not just about land appropriation. It includes cultural, economic, and psychological appropriations as well. And there are masses of settler denizens who have bought into this trend, who cannot so easily attribute their having bought into the trend to government influence, and who are not being held accountable for their actions. And who are not fully cognizant, perhaps not even cognizant at all, of the implications their actions have when they buy and wear culturally appropriated clothes, therefore approving and fueling colonialism through cultural appropriation. So I've just begun to scratch the surface of what it means for a settler denizen to act as a petty sovereign. How this role plays out today needs far more consideration in order for us to be able to consider how this role might be manipulated so that instead of contributing to colonialism, petty sovereigns might contribute to decolonization. And this might actually mean elimination of the role, which perhaps begins with an internally held accountability, where those petty sovereigns who begin to learn their stories, begin interacting with treaty citizenship, can turn to others and help them to see their settler privilege and how they're contributing to colonial processes. So to briefly conclude, the settler denizen is someone who does not know and does not engage with their stories of settlement, and who does not engage with treaty citizenship. And while this engagement is not a sufficient condition, because settlers must also recognize and take up responsibility to act towards decolonization, it is a necessary condition. And I'm still struggling with my own identity as a settler denizen. While I've come a long way from that fourth-year classroom, I know I still have a lot of work to do to engage my stories, to know and engage my treaty citizenship. But I'm working on it, and it's crucial that other settler denizens begin to as well. Non-Indigenous Canadians, as we have seen, contribute to colonialism through a variety of ways, as explored here through their relationship with the state and through actions that capitalize on their settler privilege. We're implicated in an ongoing process of colonialism, recognizing the ways through which we do so, the roles that we play as settler denizens, and exploring our stories and treaties and our relations with Indigenous peoples will be the only way that we can begin to step away from contributing to colonialism and refocus on contributing to decolonization. And we're necessary actors within decolonization because of our involvement within colonialism. But it starts with stories, investigating our stories and the roles we play so that we can eventually demand change from ourselves and from the state. But we have to start with our stories. Thank you.